Hello, everyone, and welcome to my session. In the general chit chat before we let everybody in, I was talking to Taylor and Chelsea. It's kind of nice to not talk to logisticians and students. I love talking to logisticians and students, but it's a nice change of pace to not have that be the group that I'm talking to. This is an interactive session. The first 10, 12 minutes is a more formal type of presentation. But then using the handout that's in the chat, I'll be asking you to ask me questions about it. That will make more sense.
Jeremy, I believe you just muted yourself.
I don't know how that happened. So anyway, there's a handout. We'll use it after the kind of formal part of the presentation. I won't be sharing my screen at that time. So feel free to turn on your camera and we'll just have a good general chit chat. And you can also put your questions in the chat as well. And if for some reason you can't download from Zoom, send a note to Taylor and she can email it to you so you do have it. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm Lieutenant Colonel retired Jeremy Banta. Normally the who am I part of this is a very short elevator speech, but in this instance, my Army background is really important. So I'll talk about it a little bit more since it's integral to the session. I am a 30-year logistics industry vet. I did 15 years in the civilian sector, retail, logistics, manufacturing, all kinds of distribution. Then I went full-time military with the Ohio Army National Guard, spent 15 years there as a senior logistician. I have a BSBA in logistics and marketing from Ohio State and my MBA from Franklin. And I retired about 4 years ago. And I'm literally doing my dream job. This is something that I wanted to do for a while, which is teach full-time. I'm definitely done with leadership. I've been doing leadership roles my entire life. Well, maybe I'm done with leadership, mostly. But I do love teaching. I like the mentoring, teaching, coaching part of being an officer and being a soldier. And now I get to do that every day. But why am I here? Why am I doing this? Why am I talking about my military background? Well, if you've read the quote, you'll know that people will do almost anything for a great leader. And some people are born leaders, and most people can become a good leader. But my personal experience is there is a lack of leadership lessons when you're a young adult, when you're working, and there's not a lot of formal training on how to be a leader. You'd think the Army would have taught us officers how to be leaders, but they don't. We train on our tasks. We do professional development, things like that, but there's not a lot of formal training on how to be a good leader. And while I don't like accolades and I don't necessarily talk a lot about my military background, I realize I have a very unique experience to share. So this is kind of a rundown of my career. I've been doing something with the military since I joined the ROTC program at Ohio State in '88. And in addition to those two deployments you see at the bottom, I did hurricane relief duty in Louisiana in 2008 for Hurricane Gustav. And I did humanitarian aid duty in Nicaragua in '99 after Hurricane Charlie. The most significant of that was the 367 days I spent in Iraq, not that we were counting, but I was in Iraq supporting Operation Iraqi Freedom. And I was the commander of the 1485th Transportation Company, Ohio Army National Guard. We were a company of 60 flatbed semi-trucks with over 180 soldiers. And that row of trucks you see on the top is one platoon, and there were 3 platoons of those trucks. So you can see we were dealing with a lot of equipment and a lot of soldiers. We lived in Balad, Iraq, which was right in the middle of the Sunni Triangle. And if you're not familiar with the Sunni Triangle, there it is. There, kind of to the north is Balad, and down in the bottom right corner is Baghdad. We drove to Baghdad every single day and hauled back repair parts that were flown into Baghdad International Airport. So those were coming from all over the world. Then they were sent up to Balad, where they were distributed all throughout the Iraqi theater. And we drove on literally the most dangerous roads in the world at the time. I know the term literally is used a lot right now, but at the time, these were deemed to be the most dangerous roads. And the most notable one, and if you watched the news back then, you probably heard a lot about it, was Route Irish. So think I-670 Route Irish connected downtown Baghdad and the airport. And we had to drive on it every single day. And just so you kind of have a picture of what it looked like, this is my soldiers doing a pre-convoy safety brief with a unit that we were getting ready to escort. Here's some of my soldiers providing convoy security. And if you'll notice, there's not a lot of protection for them. They don't have a lot of body armor on, and the trucks definitely don't have a lot of armor. This is one of my gun trucks. So you can see it's kind of a piece together. I mean, it's a formal military gun truck. But you can see there's not a lot of protection for the soldiers. So this was pretty early on before we had up-armored Humvees and up-armored trucks. Early on, we saw a lot of what we called hillbilly armor. So people just kind of piecing things together to keep soldiers safe. And I show you all of this so you can see how critical my own command philosophy was. And again, I'll use the term literally. It literally kept soldiers alive in the most dangerous environments. So a very important piece to my command time. Well, after I left command, I realized that this command philosophy wasn't just for commanders. The Army, it wasn't a formal rule, but you had to have a command philosophy when you were in command. And I realized after I came out of command, well, why can't I just have this, in my normal job and in my civilian job? So I turned my command philosophy into my leader philosophy, and I gave it to every group of soldiers and employees that I've ever had since then. And that's why we're here. So before we kind of get into it, let's talk about what a leader philosophy is. I pulled this definition from Indeed.com, just so I wasn't doing something in my own words. So you can see here, it's something that's personalized, it's structured, and it's to show how you lead others, and generally includes your leadership theory, your attitudes, guiding principles, behaviors, things like that. And it varies. It's going to vary job to job, and it's going to vary as you grow and learn things. Now, this is part of my personal definition. It is a device to tell others how you lead. It's a device to tell them what's important to you and tips for them to be a good team member. It's also a really good document to tell yourself who you really are, how you lead and how you act, what you need from others for success, and how to act appropriate and maintain your integrity. So it's a really good way to formalize that for yourself if you really haven't thought about it. There are some things that the leader philosophy is not, and this is coming from personal experience. It's not a lecture or an admonishment. So when you give someone your leader philosophy, it's not a you need to do this, or you need to do this, or this is how you're supposed to follow me. It's not a framework of what you want to be. You have to be truthful when you develop this. If it does not reflect who you are and it reflects your dreams and accomplishments and aspirations, then it's not going to be a very good document. It's not a formal accountable document. However, if you're printing it and giving it to people, they're going to hold you to it. But again, it's not anything that's necessarily formal. And mainly, it is not a device to make you look good. I've had commanders do these wonderful command philosophies that make them look like the most wonderful leaders, and then they never backed it up. And it was simply a device to make them look good. So make sure that you're not doing that if you do your own leader philosophy. How do you make one? We're going to go through that a little bit, but there aren't really any rules. There's not a prescribed format or a method. It's an ongoing process, so yours may change over time. It actually should change over time, and it is yours alone. So you can't just use somebody else's, but you can borrow pieces. So if you see something in here that you like of mine that may apply to you, feel free to borrow it, but you just can't take mine and use it for yourself. So getting into this, let's say you've never thought about this and you want to create your own leadership philosophy. Can you define your own leadership style? Well, identifying your style is important. And these aren't necessarily all positive traits that you can attribute to yourself. It's okay to be a bad boss occasionally if you do it constructively and it works. Thus the term yeller. You may be a yeller. I am not a yeller. If my soldiers heard me yell, they really perked up because they knew I wasn't a yeller. and they knew it was important. But it's good to let folks know what type of person you are. If you're a type of person you get enthusiastic and energized and it sounds like you're yelling all the time, that might be a good thing to put in your command philosophy. I personally tend to micromanage when I get stressed or if someone isn't doing their job. So if I put that in my leadership philosophy and all of a sudden a soldier or an employee finds that I'm micromanaging them and they've heard me tell them why I'm micromanaging, it may have them perk up a little bit. So here's your chance to really be honest with yourself. Do you say you collaborate if you really don't? This isn't who you want to be. It's who you really are. So what if you can't define your own leadership style? Well, so there's some questions you can ask yourself and some things you can do. So first, look at your past normal everyday behavior and how you've led in previous situations. How do you act normally? How do you act when you're stressed? Look at the good and the bad, and have you changed over time? Use those scenarios to try to develop who you are. Look at all of us have, you hear lots of good things in your career. Every now and then you hear a bad thing and you always focus on those. Well, go back to those bad. Why did you hear that bad thing? Did you change? Did it change your leadership style? So look at your past and your current behavior. Second, look at your interests. What makes you happy? What do you like to do? Are you artistic or are you technical? Do you do a lot of social outreach? Do you like administrative work? Telling your followers how you are will help with this too. If they know that you're more of an artistic type person and more of a creative leader, they can react, to that. The technical person may like more direct, exact approaches, where the artist may like collaboration and creative leadership styles. So this definitely helps tell your followers what kind of leader you are. And then also, what are your needs? What do you need from your team? Do you need a lot of feedback or do you like to work independently? Do you need encouragement and support? Do you need some time for reflection? There are times when in a serious situation, I need a minute or two. And if my followers know that, they're not going to pester me when they come to me with a problem. And they're going to realize that and as I stop, I'm not necessarily ignoring them or I'm not being indecisive. I am actually thinking, I'm taking the time to do that because that's how I do things. This last one is the hardest. Who are you really? What comes out when you're stressed? These are really tough to admit, but like I said before, these can be leveraged to your advantage if you're aware of them and you let people know. If you're prone to quick, short outbursts that really don't mean anything, then your followers know that. They'll let you get through that and then they'll be like, okay, that's good. I had a wonderful soldier that worked for me for years that loved to vent. And all my previous bosses would try to argue with him when he would vent. And I realized I just needed to let him vent. Let him vent for a minute, and then I would be, okay, all right, Sergeant, what do we need to do? And he was fine, just as long as I let him vent. So if he would tell his followers that, it would have worked to his advantage. Okay, let's say you go through this too, and you're still not completely sure. There are lots of tools out there that can help you tell you what your leadership style is. I'm sure you've seen most, if not all of these, and these can help. Some are free, some are fee-based. They're all great assessments, but they're tools and they should be used as a guide, not as an exact assessment. I highly recommend to all of to you and to all my former soldiers and employees, you take multiple ones and use them accordingly. Look for trends. And full disclosure, a lot of this came from my Berkman assessment because it was spot on. It was a really, really, really good one. If you're not familiar with it, it is fee-based, but it's really, really good. So feel free to use these to help you determine your leadership style as well. So, and speaking of Berkman, Berkman measures 9 components of your personality. And these don't necessarily work in a vacuum, but they do work all together. And if you're struggling to try to develop your own leadership philosophy, these 9 behavioral components are a really good thing to sit and think about, or maybe sit down and write about to help determine what kind of leader you really are. So there are other factors that help determine your leadership philosophy. This is something that I don't think people talk about enough, as their pet peeves. It definitely doesn't get addressed enough, if at all. But they're definite, significant aspects of your personality, and they tie directly to your leadership style. So let's look at this first one here. And you'll recognize this if you've already looked at my leadership philosophy that was the handout. Right time, right place, right uniform. This, and I'm going to get passionate for a second. This is the primary tenet of being a soldier. You have to be in the right place at the right time with the right uniform and the right equipment. And if you can't manage that as a soldier, then you need to really work on being a soldier, because you're not going to be able to get anything else accomplished. So this was a big pet peeve of mine. I did not like soldiers coming into a meeting, first formation, a few minutes late, unless they had a good excuse. That was perfectly fine. But those soldiers or employees that are habitually late. And if they are habitually late, work with them to try to figure out why. But this is a pet peeve of mine, so it is definitely in my leadership style. And you can see a few other ones in there that are good things to look at. What idiosyncrasies do you have that are worth admitting and telling your followers about? Personal philosophies. These are a little harder to put into your command philosophy, and I'd always encourage you to think about what you actually put into your leadership philosophy on these things, but they're still good to think about when you're developing your philosophy. You will see a reference to the golden rule in mine, but you won't see my personal affiliations or my spiritual beliefs directly reflected in my command philosophy or my leader philosophy. But they are things that I thought about when I created it. And past experiences, obviously, good and bad bosses, bad jobs, groups you've been involved with, even your parents. I like to think this last comment, I don't know if I attribute it to myself or not, but how many times have you been in a situation and it was awful and you're like, okay, how do I keep that from happening again? Those types of experiences that you've had in your past help develop your leader philosophy. And then also looking at what we call in the military, the echelons above. Mission statements, vision, values of where you work or your department, or groups that you're affiliated with, or even looking to your boss or your mentor. Since everybody had a command philosophy in the Army, we would always look at our leader's command philosophy. And if there was something in there that we needed to put in ours or we thought was appropriate for ours, then we would do that too. And it needs to keep going. Mine changed all the time. I can tell you that there were multiple situations where I had a bad situation come up at work, and I immediately went up to my office that was upstairs, went up to my computer and updated my leader philosophy based on that situation as it was happening. So this is a living document. And granted, I'm not in a leadership role right now, so I don't update it as often as I used to. But I think the most recent one I did was 2018, which was well into being a college professor. Okay, so this is my leader philosophy, and this is where we're going to, I'll stop sharing here in a second, and we'll do some question and answer. So there's two parts to it. There is a front and a back. On the back, you'll notice things that are kind of pertinent to a specific job. So I kind of summarize my general leader philosophy there, but you'll notice everything else applies to the specific job. So this one got updated when I got a new job or got a promotion, or when something maybe changed at work, or maybe a boss's priority changed. So this was not necessarily the bulk of my command philosophy, but it was stuff that was important to the soldier. The real meat of it is on the front, and it's this section here. And this is where I'm going to stop sharing. And what I would like you to do is go through these, look at them, and ask me questions about them. What do they mean? I purposely left some having some military jargon or some acronyms on purpose. And some may be self-explanatory, but there may be a story behind them. They're all on there for a reason. And if I remember the exact story, I'll tell you, or I can talk to you in generalities. But this is where, once I stop sharing, we can start chit chat. Okay, I will invite you to turn on cameras. And I can never keep these sessions straight. Is there a raise hand on this one? I don't think there is.
There is, yes.
So feel free to raise your hand. I've noticed stuff in the chat. I haven't been able to completely watch it, but I will try to address some of those too. Taylor, feel free if there's something in the chat that you think I should talk about, jump in.
Yeah.
Feel free to ask a question.
Amy has a good question. It says, I'm wondering how these leadership skills apply to those of us who are not in supervisory roles.
Well, when I give this session to students, it's tailored a little bit different. No pun intended, Taylor. Um, oh, that was a bad dad joke. So I start off by asking people to raise their hand if they're a leader. And in a group of students, you get maybe a quarter to a third actually raise their hand. But so then I ask, all right, so how many are big brothers and big sisters? How many are in a group? How many are maybe involved in an organization? And usually when I'm talking to students, they're involved in an organization, either a peer group or honor society or something like that. So naturally, being involved in stuff like that and choosing to come to an event that I'm doing about leadership, you're naturally a leader. So I'm in the exact spot. I don't have any employees right now, but I work with a lot of different people, and I'm involved out in the community a lot. And I follow this stuff still to this day, because if I lose my integrity as an individual, I'm not going to be I'm not going to be well respected. So while this is a leader philosophy, you don't necessarily have to be a formal leader in order to live by this stuff. So hopefully that answers your question. All right. Feel free to ask. Anybody have a question about one? Just jump right in. Kimberly Newton, you raised your hand. Go ahead.
All good. I was just curious where "don't do stupid" comes from.
So that's a good one. And I'll tell you, I wish I could remember the exact scenario where I put that one on there, but there are so many stories that I have from the "don't do stupid." I think that was more of a catchphrase in the Army. There's a lot of times you'd get an order from someone, or someone would come up and you'd be like, is that really your solution? In the military, you could be a little more candid with your soldiers. You necessarily can't do that with students or employees or people you're advising. You have to be a little less direct. But that was my way of telling soldiers that I'm going to challenge you. If you do something stupid, I'm going to point out that it was stupid. So that's a little bit more of a specific Army one, but it is still a fun one to have in there. Let's see. I see bad news doesn't get better over time. I think that kind of makes sense. But I like to tell my soldiers and my employees, I am the leader that you need to bring stuff to. I will be very receptive to problems. And I want to know them right away, because I'm going to be the real angry person, even though I didn't get very angry often. But if you don't tell me about something, you try to hide it and cover it up. That's when you're actually going to see Lieutenant Colonel Banta come out and not Jeremy. So that was a really good way to let my employees and soldiers know to bring things to me. Now that actually backfired. So in my last job with the military, I was the senior logistician for an entire division. Not an Army division, but a division, like a corporate division. And all my employees, we had flexible work schedules. So all my managers started really early. And every morning when I would come in at 7:30, generally there would be 2 or 3 of them waiting on me with a problem. So I had no problems for Lieutenant Colonel Bantle until 8 a.m. So I could at least come in, turn on my computer, get my coffee. But they knew that they brought stuff to me all the time. And I loved it because I could say, give my direction first thing in the morning, and then everybody would go about their business. So that's kind of where that one comes from. What's a Charlie Foxtrot? I think some people know what that is. The Charlie, so it's a military phonetic alphabet. Charlie stands for cluster. Foxtrot is F. I'll let you figure it out. You can Google it. Don't say it. Students like to spout that one out. And I can't remember if it's a Charlie Foxtrot, then tell me it's a Charlie Foxtrot. Yeah, tell me if something's messed up. Tell me it's messed up. I'm perfectly fine if I tell, so this is what we're going to do this morning. This is the plan. Blah 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 blah. Here's what you need to do. Here are your time hacks. I don't want my soldiers walking away going, no man, that's a Charlie Foxtrot. I want them to go, sir, wait a minute. I don't think you're thinking through, or is this from someone else, because this sounds kind of messed up. So I wanted them to tell me if it was. And if they thought it was and it wasn't, then that was a great opportunity for us to actually talk about it a little bit more, and explain why it isn't a cluster. Then again, it might have been. Most of the times when my soldiers came to me and told me something was a Charlie Foxtrot, it actually was a Charlie Foxtrot. How did I follow up when I delegated? A lot of that depended on the person I delegated to. In today's virtual world, it's a little bit harder to do. You have to be a really good manager of your own personal stuff to follow up. But depending on my managers, I knew when I had to follow up with them, whether it was a week, whether it was they would come to me when they were done, or whether it was an hour after I gave them the task to make sure they were actually doing it. So that all depended on the individual. If you are the type of person that you always follow up 1 week later, that might be great. That could backfire on you. And it also may annoy the person that doesn't need to be followed up with. So I would definitely tailor that to the individual. But let people know that you're going to follow up. And when you do follow up after you've delegated something, it's not because you don't trust them. Well, it might be because you don't trust them, but you let them know that it's because this is how you are and this is what you do. So I've seen NCO pop up a few times on here asking the question. So NCO is a non-commissioned officer. The Army, and I think on that handout at the bottom, I have the Army ranks. So the best way to describe NCO versus officer is NCO is blue collar, officer is white collar. I think those terms are kind of falling out of favor, but that's the best way to kind of look at it. So officers develop the plans, issue them to the non-commissioned officers. The non-commissioned officers make stuff happen. So we're going to dig a hole. That's the officer job. I would give it to the NCO. The NCO would figure out what kind of hole, where the hole was going to be dug, how we were going to support that hole being dug, who was going to dig the hole, and how we were going to upkeep that hole. And then I would follow up to check to make sure they were doing it right. But as an officer, if I would say, we're going to dig a hole, we're going to dig it at these coordinates, it's going to be 15 feet deep by 30 feet wide. Now I'm doing NCO business. And that's why I have NCO business is NCO business, officer business is officer business. That came from a very specific instance. We were out in California at our summer training, which was 3 weeks long, out in the middle of the desert. We were hauling tanks from Fort Irwin, California, to Camp Yermo, which was the railhead. So every day out in the hot sun in the desert, loading and unloading tanks and other equipment and loading them on rail cars. Very hot, steamy work. And I walk into my command tent and two of my senior NCOs are literally nose to nose yelling at each other. Well, to get to my desk, I had to walk between them. So I say, excuse me, and kind of, they both part and continued to yell at each other. And my first sergeant, who's the senior non-commissioned officer, said, aren't you going to do something about that? I'm like, no, that's NCO business. I mean, if they come to blows, which I knew they weren't, but if they come to blows, obviously we're going to jump in, but they need to work that out. If I jump in now, I'm undermining their authority. They were two soldiers that had distinct responsibilities and they were trying to figure something out. I'm like, if they can't figure it out, then they should come to you. And if you can't figure it out, then you come to me. I'm the commander. This is NCO business. And she's like, okay, well, I guess that makes a lot of sense. And that's actually when I added that NCO business is NCO business to my command philosophy. Let's see. Failure isn't an option. How do you respond to subordinates when it happens anyway? Let's see. I can't remember specifically. A failure is an option, but it happens anyway. That one's on there because when I was more senior in the Army, we started to have this mentality of zero defects. And while zero defects sounds familiar, if anybody's familiar with Lean Six Sigma, perfection is impossible. So zero defects is an unattainable goal. So if you're constantly being led by people that say zero defects and they won't tolerate anything, as soon as failure happens, leaders start to take over, and then you start getting micromanaged, or then you don't do anything, and then your subordinate leaders actually don't get to learn from their mistakes. So the failure isn't an option, but it happens anyway. Lets my leaders know that it's okay to fail. And I'm not going to judge you because you failed. I'm going to judge you based on what your plan was and how did you get to where you failed, and how do you respond from that. If you failed at something and you didn't learn from it and you fail at the same thing again, or you fail in the exact same way again, now I'm going to micromanage you a little bit more. Now we're going to talk about, should you be in another job? But I wanted my followers and my soldiers to know that failure is, I mean, it is kind of an option. You still want to keep that failure as an option mentality, but you don't want to hold people to that, because it's going to happen. And that let them know that you know what, I'm willing to admit that if I fail, that it's okay too. I'm not perfect as well. See more comments in here. So somebody ask a real question. I don't want to be the only one talking.
I think Amy Hawkins had, she put it in the chat too, but Amy, feel free to unmute and ask away.
Nope, you're still muted.
Yeah, I'm not Amy Hawkins, but I ask a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm Amy Burney. So I don't know if I'm the wrong Amy, but I asked about your follow-up. And oh, hi, Amy Hawkins. I see you there too. My question was, so in your follow-up, do you actually make a specific follow-up plan for each individual who's under you? And then do you have a way that you document what happened at these follow-up interactions and the progress that's made toward, each individual's responsibilities?
I did not, but I didn't because as a commander, I had hundreds of soldiers and
Sure.
many leaders. And in some of my senior roles, I had, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 managers and, hundreds of employees. The only time I ever got to that level is when someone needed it. Or if it was something that I needed, or we needed it to document, for inspection purposes or something.
Right.
And if I thought someone was going to be a disciplinary issue, or if heaven forbid somebody might be on the road to termination, then I definitely documented everything. But no, again, I kind of just it was a feeling method, and I also had especially in my my Monday through Friday job when I was full time with the Guard. My managers had been longtime managers, and I've had very little turnover. So I got to know them quite well. In a line unit, we moved so fast. I didn't have the time or the ability to be so exact about it. So I would say it depends. I hate to say it depends. It depends on what you need to do and what you're comfortable doing and how you manage yourself. I would say, though, if you're that type of manager, or if you're in that type of scenario, everybody should be on board. They should know how your process works, so they're not offended. Like if you're following up every week, you don't want them to be like, oh, why does she keep asking me every week? It's the same question. Well, that's because you're going through a process.
Gotcha. So when you had a lot of people, or maybe a project with many, many parts where you didn't have to document, you basically had, what do they call that, plan of the day in the military or whatever, you would go around and make sure all the wheels were turning, all the parts were functioning. When you were in a situation where there was something you had to have a paper trail for, or you had to meet certain aspects, according to the way you could check them off, then you made sure to have basically a plan, and you would document that as you met each different point, correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah. I think the term management by walking around has negative connotations sometimes.
Sure.
But, in convoy operations, the best way to see what's going on was to walk around as the soldiers were getting ready for the convoy.
Absolutely. And that's actually a good point, isn't it? Because based on how, I guess, what scenario we find ourselves in, like I have taught school, and walking around the classroom is a way you actually make sure people are engaged. It's a physical aspect that you do. And so you're talking about being like in a convoy, you've got a huge area to cover. And the best way to do it is just get out there and be part of what's going on.
Yeah. And there's a thin line between your followers or your soldiers saying you're not involved or you're too involved. And there's always going to be some that are on either side of the fence. So if you never show up, obviously you're not involved in there. Your followers, if they don't see you, they assume you're doing nothing. So if you're holed up in your office all the time, even if you're effective, you're not going to get that. But if you're out, and I would say walking the floor, because I've been in warehousing for so long, but if I'm out walking the floor 24/7, they'll be like, oh, we can't get a break. He's constantly in our faces. So yeah, you have to judge it. You have to judge it, and it's all scenario based. I hate answering questions with "and it depends," but in a lot of these, it's the best way to approach it. It depends on the specific scenario.
Sure. Well, you just told us there is no perfect world, right? So
No,
we'll
exactly.
make do with your answer. Thank you very much. I think the other Amy is actually ready to talk. She's out there.
Unmuted, yeah. No, I think I had the same question as Chelsea, which is just like, how does this process work when you're working with students? Like when you're working with professionals, it's a little bit easier to help them kind of imagine leadership and how that would work within their work role. But for some of us that are like doing this with students who maybe have never thought about being a traditional quote unquote leader at work, or, you know, and some people aren't going to rise into management and leadership. So like helping them to imagine their leadership philosophy is even a little bit harder thing to surmount. So like, are there different questions that you would ask, or do you change the process, or how does that look with students?
You know, and I've not actually done it with students. I've presented this to students and we've talked about it. And I've done it in mentor groups and peer groups and things like that. But when you're first starting out, you know, and so I would make it akin to my junior leaders, my very young lieutenants that would come in, you know, fresh out of school. You don't have a ton of experiences. So reflect back on situations that maybe weren't necessarily leadership. I mean, look at your parents, look at other bosses. And it's okay to draft up what you think your leader philosophy is. It's a living document. It's going to change. So at least start with something. It doesn't have to be as comprehensive as mine. I mean, geez, mine's from, you know, 15, 20, 30 years of military leadership. So obviously I have 2 pages. I'm going to have to edit it down. But a simple paragraph, if you flip to the back side and it says Lieutenant Colonel Banta's leadership style, that is the best place to start, you know. And in this case, it might be, you know, who you aspire to be or who you think you are because you just don't have the experience. But the most important part is getting people to understand that this needs to be thought about. So that's the best place to start. Does that answer?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
And then Mark.
Yeah, Mark, you have
Yeah. Hi, Jeremy. And thank you sincerely for your service, Lieutenant Colonel.
Sure, thanks.
Don't mess with the pack order. It's there for a reason. Is that basically chain of command?
No. So that's actually different. So the pack order is a reference to wolf packs. They kind of naturally have, you know, you're the alpha, the dominant, and that, you know, that in an organization that may not necessarily be the boss. I think we've all been in a scenario where you're like, why does everybody listen to that person? Why is that person in charge? Or, hey, you know what? This is the person that we need to listen to. Maybe the 65-year-old warehouse guy that has unloaded trucks his entire life, he probably knows a lot about the facility and he may not be the boss, but everybody looks up to him. If you come into a scenario and you're like, why does everybody listen to that guy? Well, I'm the boss. I'm going to show everybody who the boss is. Now you're messing with the pack order. And that was very specific in the military because you'd have to pay attention to what that pack looked like because you didn't want to poke it. Because you could poke at someone that seemed to be a junior or a subordinate, and that might be the one person that the general always goes to. And if they don't like you, you've now disrupted the pack order and you possibly have hurt your career.
Right.
So hopefully that makes sense.
It does. And Jeremy, I want to add something to that. I'm a veteran as well, so I'm like all about everything that you're saying, and I know exactly what you're talking about in most situations, but also the example of when a person may be a subject matter expert about something, and they may be able to get you something that you may not as a leader be able to achieve. So just say, for instance, a student may be really good at a particular item or idea. However, they may be able to get into somewhere where you can't. So that allows them to be a leader in that situation if you stay with that. But if you disrupt that to say, well, you can't do that because I can't have access to that, then it kind of disrupts that entire process. So basically the same thing that he's saying, but that's kind of how I look at it as well.
Yeah. And, you know, and we always like to say it was a small army. So that whole pack order, if you disrupt the pack order early on in your career, you may run across one of those individuals later on in your career. And it may be to your advantage or not. So yeah, the pack order thing was really important, especially in an environment where, you know, we're in austere conditions and we have to rely on everybody, you know, for our daily lives. Messing with the pack order was really important in a situation like that because we couldn't go home at night and get away from it or go to HR. There's one on there I want to talk about. bodies are dead. So, and I put a little explanation on there after I got out of the service because this made sense to people in the military. So this one came up when I was in Iraq. We had switched to, so the hierarchy in the military is the company is like the lowest official level of a group of soldiers, and then you report to a battalion, and the battalion reports to a brigade. So my battalion had switched; they had left. We were kind of in the process of leaving, rotating out, and we had a new battalion come in, and that battalion commander came down to my area of operations, and he did this with all his companies. He wanted kind of an overview of what we were doing. Who we were, where we were from, and he spent half a day with every one of his downtrace companies. So he gets there, we have some niceties, we sit down, and my soldiers are out, preparing for a convoy. He's like, all right, tell me about the 1485th. I said, well, sir, we have 167 bodies on ground. And he went, hold on, soldier, bodies are dead. Those are soldiers. I don't want to hear you say bodies. I'm like, oh, and just even now, I get a chill down my spine. That was the most insensitive thing that I had inadvertently said. And I did it in a war zone. And it really struck a chord. So when I talked earlier about pet peeves and putting pet peeves in your command or your leader philosophy, this is a pet peeve. And I wanted soldiers to know that I'm going to call them out on that. First, if you say it, I'm going to pull you aside and say, and I'm going to tell you that story, and I'm going to say, don't say that. It's not, I don't like it. And I will correct you publicly about it. If you did it again, I would correct you publicly. And if you continued to do it, we'd probably have a serious discussion about why don't you listen to me. A good side of this is I used to do military funeral honors. And our leader was an NCO, and she always used the term bodies. And after about 4 or 5 times of doing it in front of me and me going, up, Sergeant Major, and she'd be like, sorry, sir. She got to the point where she would say, okay, I need 2 bodies, sir, sorry, 2 soldiers over here, 3 soldiers over here. And eventually, she eventually corrected herself, and then it became one of her pet peeves as well. So perfect example of a pet peeve and what not to, or how to tell your soldiers or your followers what your individual pet peeves are. There's a long personal question on there. I'm not going to, I will go back through and read that one. Or if somebody wants to summarize it quickly for me. Who else has a question? Feel free to chime in. I want to make this as interactive as possible.
The long one might be mine you're referring to. It's not really a question. It's just saying, like we said earlier, you don't have to be a leader to get something out of this today. We often have opportunities to do something that shows some leadership, or it also helps us how to communicate and work effectively with our leaders. So we all have opportunities to take some leadership roles in projects or whatever. And so this information is helpful with that today.
Oh yeah,
Thank you.
definitely. Yep. Yeah. I necessarily haven't briefed all the people that I work with on stuff like this, but I'm a pretty open leader, especially if I have certain things that I like to do. So the people I work with on a regular basis generally know about half of this stuff anyway, just because it kind of naturally comes out. But yeah, it comes out because I know it about myself because I've taken the time to actually develop this. What other
Jeremy,
questions?
a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the 360 feedback as a tool that you used.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I've never done, but have certainly heard the benefits of it. Can you talk a little bit about the experience of doing that, the value of using 360 feedback, and any tools that might be helpful in that?
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with 360 feedback, it's basically a program where you reach out to leaders, peers, and subordinates and ask them to give anonymous feedback about you. So there's multiple programs out there that you can use for a 360 program. The Army had a formal official one, so we used it a lot. And it was a great way to get solicited feedback anonymously from those that you worked with. It is a good tool, but I would caution its use because, one, people don't like to be mean or critical, so you'll get a lot of positive comments. And as an individual, if you're the type that hyper focuses on the one small negative comment, you could get 100 positive comments and one negative one, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm losing my mind over that one comment. So it's a good tool, but it should not be the only thing that you would ever use. And for a 360-degree program to be effective, it needs to have a lot of participants, because if you only have 2 or 3 people at each level giving you feedback, you're going to know who's saying what. So it's not really anonymous anymore. So it is a good one, but I always caution its use, because I think the Army ended up not even using it anymore because it wasn't the most effective. But it was a good tool. It was one good piece of the tool. So does that, Lee, am I saying your name? Does that help?
That does. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, some of those other ones I think are a lot more effective. And I think all of us have probably taken an assessment and went, oh yeah, that was right on. And other ones you're like, no, that's not right. And they change over time. Myers-Briggs, I was an extrovert most of my life until after I went to Iraq. And then oddly, I started to turn into an introvert. And every time I take it, the older I get, the stronger that I is. Yeah. So believe it or not, I'm a huge introvert.
Could I ask a question too?
Yeah, go ahead, Sandra.
I've heard too with the 360, like the leaders would ask for feedback from their subordinates as well, and then it works the other way around too. The subordinates ask feedback for them, so it goes both ways. Leaders give subordinates feedback, subordinates give leaders feedback, and that's where the 360 comes from. Is that correct?
That is correct, and you ask your peers too.
Yeah.
So those that you work with, those are the same rank. In theory, it should be a great program, but I think it works better if you're at an organization that does it holistically, and you get a lot of feedback. But even in the Army, it was really hard for me as a lieutenant colonel. I had to pick 3 people to evaluate me at a minimum that were above rank than me, that were in my chain of command. Well, as a lieutenant colonel working full time for the Ohio National Guard, that meant a colonel and 2 generals. And that was it. I didn't have a whole group of people to select from. And in a good 360 program, you're not going to get all the responses that you ask for. So you have to send out 5 or 6 for each group to get 2 or 3. Yeah, it's a great program in theory, but it's not always the best to use, especially to use as a solo standalone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
One I want to hit on before we run out of time is don't abuse rank has its privileges. That was added while I watched a lieutenant do something that I was appalled about, and I don't think she even realized what she was doing. We were doing mandatory pre-deployment training. We were at Camp Ravenna here in Ohio. We were locked down for 3 weeks. So you went out into the field. We did 3 weeks of exercises, and then we went home. Well, she had to go off post for a meeting for some reason. And she came walking back into my office area, 6, 7, 8 soldiers, all working in personnel, carrying a pizza. And she's like, look what I got to do. I got to go out for pizza. And she walks through eating her pizza. Well, to her as a young officer, she was celebrating the fact that, hey, I got to get out. Everybody else in that office was like, screw her. She got pizza and she didn't bring us any. And so she had a privilege based on her rank, but she obviously didn't necessarily abuse it, but she did flaunt it. So be very cautious about that. It's one thing to brag that you got free tickets for something. It's another to flaunt it in front of everyone and go, yeah, look what I got. Especially if it was something that wasn't necessarily available to everybody else. Okay, another question.
I have another question.
Go ahead, Amy.
You talked about your personal style, and I think one of the things I like best about this whole program that I'm really appreciating is basically the idea of understanding yourself, your weaknesses, your strengths, how you come across to others, and things like that. So I have a background as a teacher, and I find that I explain things a great deal to people in a step-by-step format. Great for being a teacher, but sometimes people hate that. They kind of feel that I am condescending in explaining all these various steps, like they're too stupid to know. So I've learned that just because I think it's a great style, it isn't necessarily what everyone appreciates. So do you have any way you get feedback from your employees, or let's say in a lot of our positions, students, where you ask them what they need from a leader, or how they respond best to different kinds of procedures? or ways of presenting material, interactions?
Yeah, I think if you're the type of leader that is a little self-deprecating and you say ahead of time, look, I know some of you aren't going to like this, but this is how I like to do this. So we're going to spend the next 20 minutes going through this step by step because it makes me feel better and it's going to help some of you. Others of you, you've got this, I understand it, but it's going to be a little painful and I apologize. I found if you're an open and honest leader, a lot of times your followers will come back and also tell you things. And if they realize that you're able to admit where you have idiosyncrasies or you have some faults or you have some areas of weakness, they'll come tell you, especially if you encourage it. I can't tell you how many times I've had soldiers come up. Now I've been usually able to figure out when soldiers, because I always say there's three types of soldiers. There's the ones that you can yell at and they get things done. There's the others that you give them straight direction. They don't particularly care to be yelled at like a soldier would be yelled at. You just give them the straight and narrow and they go do it. And then there's other ones that are like, hey, great job. I noticed this, you did this yesterday. That was awesome. Hey, can you do something for me? And there's nothing wrong with any of those, but they kind of naturally happen. But you can't always tell that. And it's good if someone will come up and tell you and say, hey, look, I like to have lots of direction, or I need time after you give me direction before you follow up because I need time to figure this out. If you are an open, honest leader, your followers sometimes naturally will do that. And if you practice this management by walking around and you chit chat with your followers, some of that will come out naturally as well, especially if you're like, hey, what are you working on? Or, whoa, what's this? Or, hey, that's a really interesting, look at your whiteboard, how you organize everything. Like, walk me through this. How do you use this? So it can kind of naturally happen, but you can also facilitate it to happen as well. Does that
answer? So have you ever, and so have you ever actually done that maybe with your students or anything, or with soldiers or employees, where you basically said, and feel free to share with me what it is that helps you learn best, or fill out this little thing, or tell me what your learning style is, or what you appreciate or don't appreciate in a supervisor, etc., that kind of thing?
Yeah, I definitely have, especially with my, when I was a senior level leader and I had director level reports, definitely worked with them, especially if someone new came in, to tell them, look, we need to talk, we need to meet. We have, I would do regular weekly meetings and touch bases. I can't remember who said it earlier, but the daily morning meeting, we had a stand up where we did a 5-minute, what's everybody working on? And yeah, I got to know those individuals very well and encouraged them to work with me on that. As far as students go, my one class that I teach, I have case studies, and I know that this might be the first time any of these students have ever written a case study. So in 2 or 3 separate occasions before they write their first one, I tell them specifically, if this is the first time you've ever written a case study, let me know. I will give you different feedback and I will take that into consideration when we grade. And it usually works, because a lot of times I'll get someone that'll say, I've never done this before. Usually they do a lot better because they're worried about it. But I'm actively asking for feedback from students on that, stuff like that.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that's tremendous. I think that your idea of explaining your style, and then, like you said, I know this may drive half of you crazy, but the other half of you really need this. So hang with me. That idea elicits collaboration, that feeling that it's not one way, that it's a process that's happening. So thank you.
Yeah. And, and that actually goes to the one that says, you're here to make soldiers' lives better. Don't ever forget that. I'm a professor. My students are there to get a degree to advance themselves. And I teach at a community college. So most of them are already working. So they have something different. They're getting, I mean, let's face it, people go to Ohio State because they want to go to Ohio State. People come to Columbus State Community College because it's the community college that's closest to them. They're there for a specific reason, to get a degree so they can get a better job. And I have to keep that in mind when I grade, when I talk, when I teach, because if I forget about that, I'm going to do something that is a detriment to them. And then, I'm starting to lose my own credibility. Mark, you had your hand up.
Yeah. You speak about know who has your 6, or I think that's your back, and make sure that they have theirs, or they know you have theirs. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, actually, I highlighted that one. I was going to bring that one up if somebody didn't ask. So your 6, I would normally poll the audience and force this out of somebody, but the 6 is your 6 o'clock. So it's your rear, your butt. the worst thing that can ever happen in a military officer's career is if you're standing in, well, maybe not the worst thing, but one of the worst things is you're standing in front of the general and you're briefing and something happens and someone that you thought had your back does not have your back. And the general questions you on something and says, hey, well, what about this? Blah, 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 blah. And you expect some support from your peers or maybe your leader, and you don't get it. And you're left standing there to defend yourself. You need to know who's going to have your back. And you need to make sure people know that you'll have theirs. You need to be a trustworthy counterpart to them. This is particularly important when it comes to your staff specifically. I wanted my staff as a senior level officer, I wanted my staff to know I will defend them in meetings ruthlessly. Even if I necessarily didn't agree with what they did, I'll still defend their decision to do what they did. And if they did something wrong, we'll talk about it afterwards. But I wanted them to know that they could go in knowing that they had my backing, whether I was in that meeting with them or not. And if they didn't get it, then again, they're going to lose the faith in me as a leader. So that's why I put it in my leadership philosophy, my command philosophy, because I wanted people to know, look, you are my soldier, you are my employee, I will have your back.
Okay. Yeah, good. I'm just going through some certification on the counselor issue, and trust is a huge issue that they say to have the client know that you have their trust.
Yeah. I mean, if you lose trust as a leader, you're almost ineffective. And that's a really, really good way to lose trust even as a peer, to someone, to not stand up for them. Davlin, I keep seeing you nod your head and smile. It's hilarious. I know you've lived through this. Every time I teach this and there's a veteran in the office, I get lots of head nods and lots of agreement. Another one I want to talk about real quick because we're almost out of time. In ruthless standards, ruthlessly if needed. If you ruthlessly enforce all the rules, you kind of lose your effectiveness. You kind of have to pick and choose the ones that are the most important. Mine was right place, right time, right uniform. I ruthlessly enforced those. And sometimes people thought I was too hard on that stuff, but that's what made a good soldier. It's what makes a good employee. Other things I didn't necessarily, I didn't like your hair. We weren't supposed to have frosted tips because it was a trendy hairstyle. I didn't care if my soldiers, I didn't care if they had frosted tips. I'm not going to come down on that because does it really impact you as a soldier? No. If you show up in the wrong uniform, yes. So that's an important one. Make sure you're not enforcing everything ruthlessly. And we are at 11:14. Thank you so much. I'm not 100% sure how to close this out. Taylor, do I need to do anything specific? Are there any announcements or anything?
No, just anyone that is wanting CEUs, please sign out with your name, the time that you're leaving, and then your ID number. And then thank you, Jeremy, so much for this conversation. This was awesome.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. It was good to interact with you all virtually. Nice to meet you all.
Jeremy.
Yeah.
I was the one that asked a personal question about rankings.
Oh, yes.
I didn't know if you could stay on just for a minute.
I can, yes.
Okay. Thank you.